We are blessed. I left Tucson and moved over here, not having an idea of what you all were like. And when I say you all, that includes you that weren't even part of this group and you joined after I did. Jesus taught us, love one another. The greatest commandment, he said, is to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, soul, strength. But the second is like the first. Love your neighbor. Even as, that is, in the same way, to the same extent, that you love yourself. And I'm going to tell you, that's not easy to do. I have preached in almost every state this side of the Mississippi, a few on the other side of the Mississippi, all the way to Alaska and to China. And I'm going to tell you what, people are people. And sometimes it's just hard to get along. Some of us are just grumpy. Some of us are not as godly as we ought to be. Some of us are a little self-righteous. But here we are. And so we're going to talk about loving one another. And I'm going to go back to our Bible class very quickly because it's such an important class and Jeff has done a grand job of covering that for us. If you missed it, it is on our YouTube video page, and I would suggest go listen to it, and then listen to this morning's class, and then you can listen to this one over again if you want to. But in that class, we covered Matthew chapter 18. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. I don't know whether you've noticed or not, but this world is ungodly. Every time you turn around, you are faced with opposition to God and holiness. Every place that you look, it seems as if they're just constantly trying to get people to live contrary to what God has said. But it's always been that way, even in the Garden of Eden with Satan. And so the temptations are there. And woe, said Jesus, because God's going to judge it. God's going to correct it. But I have nothing to do with the world. I hate social media, but I can't change it. I don't like the news as it is now portrayed on our television. Sharon and I have kept changing news channels. And what you have is the same thing, but a different face. The best advice I can give myself is turn it off. But there we are. Woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. Jesus always does this because we cannot control the big picture. We control one person, and that's me. And Jesus always points it back that here's where the real problem is. Woe to the person who puts a stumbling block before someone else. And then Jesus gives a solution to how to control that. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. We discussed in Bible class, Jesus is not suggesting that we do this literally. What he is saying is, this is how far you ought to be willing to go in order to control yourself. Some countries, if you steal, they cut your hand off. And you would be in desperate straits to decide to go ahead and take the chance. And what Jesus is saying is, metaphorically, pictorially, that's how far you need to go to avoid the temptation. And then he said, if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it out. And the point is, this was about personal temptation. What I need to do, how far I need to go to remove that from my own life. And so, how far should I go in not trying to cause you to have the same problem? I'm supposed to love you as myself. I should go that far in protecting you from the temptations that affect you and your personality. But what are these stumbling blocks? The King James, and we talked about this in Bible class, translated it offenses, and I've heard brethren use this to say, well, when you said that, that offended me. And that's not at all what this verse is talking about. And so when you get to the New American Standard Version that came out, they translated that word stumbling blocks, and that's what we've just read. But then a newer translation, the English Standard Version, came out, and it translated it temptations. And now we're getting to where it really is. Woe unto the man that puts a temptation in front of somebody else. Whether it be personally tempting him or enticing him into a situation that is going to be a temptation for him, setting before him that which he is tempted to do evil by. Woe unto the person that does that. So this stumbling block are the things and the actions and the situations that can cause a brother to sin. Woe, said Jesus, unto that person. But there's the principle. Did you all grasp that? And the problem that I always had, underneath the Old Testament, God oftentimes dealt with them not according to the principle, but simply according to law. How much did I have to give? 10% was the tithe. How should I? And they gave it. But in the New Testament, you and I are faced with a great challenge, and that is most of the teaching of the New Testament is according to principle. And now I got to take the principle and figure out how to apply it. And I'm going to tell you, that's where the problem comes. That's where you and I disagree and sometimes are disagreeable. And it's not about the principle. Now, I'm going to give an illustration that'll probably get me in trouble when we finally post this on YouTube and all my preacher friends see it. But I'm still going to use it. I sat down at a table one time. I was late to lunch, and two friends were sitting there, and they were having a rather heated discussion, and it had to do with modesty. And the area of modesty that was being discussed was how long must a woman's dress be in order to be modest. You all may have had this discussion. And one friend got so aggravated at his other friend that he drew two legs. Well, they were supposed to be legs. They were just two sticks. And he drew a kneecap on that. And he took the pencil and he handed it to the other guy and he said, now, draw me a line of where that has to be. Now I'm going to tell you, my first thought was, oh, don't draw a line. Don't draw the line. Because no matter where you draw that line, it's wrong according to somebody. I would have just put the pencil on the table and said, no, the principle comes that you have to, of yourself, decide. Now, you all did that this morning. You all got up and didn't put on a pair of shorts and come to church. You decided in your own, and my point on that is, we have to decide the application. And that's what we're doing with this temptation part. What is the application that is going to be made? And the best illustration, and Jeff alluded to it, was Philippians chapter 2. But it's also discussed in Romans 14 on when brethren disagree on what they ought to eat or not eat towards themselves. And then it was covered in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And I decided, and I called Jeff because I didn't want to tromp all over where he had been. So I'm going to just quickly run through what Curtis read and then finish the rest of that chapter. Corinth. Wow. Corinth was down at the very bottom of the Aegean Sea. Now, Paul came to the top of that, where it was Philippi, and then he moved on down to Thessalonica, and then he moved on down to Athens, and then he moved on over to Corinth, and he preached and started churches in every one of those places where he had been. And so, as he came down, he's going to come to Corinth. But now Corinth was situated in a unique place, because ships that would go from the Aegean Sea over to Italy, and of course that's where Rome is, they could either go down around that Corinthian peninsula, but it was loaded with islands and barriers. It was treacherous. Or what they could do, since Corinth was down at the end of this island, towards the end of that, and I keep getting closer and closer so you can see this, here's that little bitty stretch of land. And that's where Corinth was. But there was this little stretch of about 2 miles, maybe a little more. And they learned that they could actually take these ships and drag them over that little piece of land. And it was safer and easier and cheaper to do that. But all of the sailors on the boat now have free time while it's being dragged. And so Corinth became a wicked sailor town, a tourist town. What do you do with all these sailors that have nothing else to do? And it became so wicked that it became a byword among the Roman Empire. And they would insult somebody and say, "You're acting like a Corinthian." And so what took place was, in this town, the Roman Empire was governed by idols. And in Corinth, there were idol after idol after idol after idol. And along with all of the idols came immorality and drunkenness. And so no matter where you went, to which temple you went, there was this temptation that was there. And then there was another problem, because they offered all of these sacrifices unto their idols. But they took the extra meat that was left over from those sacrifices and took them down to the marketplace, and that's where you would go. You didn't have H-E-B. You didn't have Safeway. You went down to the marketplace. But if you bought that meat, you knew where it came from. It came out of an idol's temple and had been offered unto an idol. And so now, what am I going to do about that? Well, if you're a Christian, it poses a problem. And so Paul came to Corinth and he preached, and Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, he believed in the Lord with all of his household. And many of the Corinthians, when they heard Paul preaching, they believed and were baptized. And you know what that made them? That made them us. That made them disciples. Or as Paul alluded to them in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, to the saints that are at Corinth. And so here now, they're going to have to live with it. That's their town. That's their home. That's where their family is. That's where their job is. That's where their friends are. That's what they know. And so, but now one thing has changed. But that one thing has changed everything. They are now disciples of Jesus, and they're no longer of the world. And they're going to have to decide how to live this. And so Paul warned them in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 before we get to chapter 8. He said, do you not know? Now it's rather interesting. Paul's going to ask that question about 6 times in the book of Corinthians. They did know. Would you not acknowledge this? The unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor the effeminate, nor the homosexual, nor thieves, nor the covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers. And that was Corinth. That was their neighbors. That was them before Paul got there. And such were some of you. But the Corinthians believed and were baptized. And when they were baptized, they were sanctified and washed and justified in the name. They're now God's people, a holy city. No, it's not a holy city. It's an ungodly city. And they're going to have to live in the midst of that. So Paul writes to them. Now, concerning things that are sacrificed unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge. We all know some things. The Corinthians thought they knew everything. And that was the problem. Knowledge is not a problem, but knowing things that aren't so is a major problem. One of the funniest stories I remember reading of a preacher by the name of C.R. Nichols. Maybe you have this little C.R. Nichols pocket encyclopedia. And he wrote and he preached. He was a wonderful student of the Bible. And somebody walked up to him and said, Brother Nick, how come you're so smart? And Brother Nicholas said, because I don't know so many things that aren't so. And I want you to think about that. The problem is, every one of us knows things that just aren't so. And we share them with one another. And we debate them. And we argue about them. And so here were the Corinthians, and he said, we know that everybody has knowledge, but some knowledge makes you arrogant and puffed up. But true knowledge won't do that. Because true knowledge is going to be tempered with love. Love for God and love for one another. And so if anyone supposes that he knows anything, he is not yet known. But I speak with the tongues of men and angels, Paul's going to say in chapter 13. But I don't have love. I become the noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I know all mysteries and all knowledge and all faith so as to remove mountains, but I do not have love, I'm nothing. It profits nothing. You're not what God wants you to be. You're not acting like God wants you to be. So, knowledge is good. But knowledge has to be tempered with a love for God and a love for one another. We have to know things. Because we have to know what's right and what's wrong. We have to know what God is going to judge. We have to know what God Himself loves. But as we gather this knowledge, we learn some things that are right, but they're not necessary. It's okay. Should I get married or not? Well, it's too late for me. I decided that 50 years ago. Did I have to get married? Absolutely not. I chose. Now, there's that is necessary, things that God says you have to do this, and then there are things that we make judgments about. Some of those are a matter of liberty. A friend that was a preacher, and because of the situation in his life, he was, we would call it, rich. And he chose to always drive Cadillacs. Now, this was back in the 50s when if you drove a Cadillac, that's the luxury car. But he not only drove them, he traded them off about every other year. So he was always driving a new one. Could he afford it? Absolutely. Was it okay? Absolutely. Is it okay for a preacher to drive a Cadillac? Absolutely not. Well, that's the answer he kept getting. But do y'all realize that's not unnecessary? We don't have to keep the preacher in poverty. But there's the problem. We need to know the difference. We need to know the difference between things that are mandated and absolute and things that are okay, but not necessary to bind upon each other. So if anyone loves God, he's known by God, approved by God, and therefore concerning the eating of things that have been sacrificed to an idol. And I'm going to tell you, that's the meat at Corinth. Almost anywhere you got it. Now we know, do y'all see this? We know there is no such thing as an idol in the world that is in reality. An idol, said Isaiah, was something they chopped down a tree and they carved it up and they nailed it in place and then they said, this is our God. Remember Aaron in the Old Testament? And it says they took all of the gold and their jewelry and they threw it in the fire and out came a molten calf. And you all know that's not true. They melted that gold and they made that golden calf. And then they said, this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. And you're all going, that's crazy. You just made that stupid thing. How could it have guided us out of Egypt if we just made it? And the answer is because the image was not the God. The image was the image of their concept of God. And so what Paul is saying here is, and so we see all these images that have been made and they've been sacrificed to as if they were God. But you know, as a Christian, there is one God. So even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven and earth, as indeed there are many gods, do y'all notice the small g? Now for everybody listening to this, if it gets on YouTube and not watching, I did the magic quotation marks. Small g. But for us, there is but one God and Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for Him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through Him. So these people that were worshiping all of these fantasy gods, that wasn't real. Now, do you all realize Paul did not deny that there are angels, spirit beings? He did not deny that God Himself was a spirit. He did not deny that there were evil spirits. What he was saying is, they're not God. And particularly these idol images, they're not God. And so that which has been sacrificed unto them has been sacrificed unto something that is not real, so it doesn't matter. So I know you all's sacrifice that to an idol, I'm eating meat. You all sacrifice that as if that was going to honor some make-believe God. I'm having a hamburger. And that's all there is to me. I bought it because it was meat. And so I'm going to eat it. Now, Paul later wrote in the pastoral, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, God has made all meats clean. It's acceptable to eat it. And it's going to be the false teachers that tell you you can't eat certain meats. So for us, well, you and I have never really faced this problem because I buy my meat at H-E-B. And if I want a whole lot of meat, I go over to Sam's Club. But it's meat. It's not been offered to anything. But if you bought it in Corinth, it had been offered to an idol. And not all men have the knowledge about God and these idols and what it does. So they, having grown up doing this, having participated and been part of the temple process, they can't separate that in their mind. When they eat that, since it's been offered to an idol, it must be. And now they look over and there I am eating my ribeye steak. And they go, oh, look at that. He thinks it's okay to worship an idol. And so they dig in. And not knowing this, they eat that as if it were sacrificed unto an idol. And where did they get the idea it's okay to do that? They saw me eating meat. Now, I was not eating it with a mind of the idol. I was not committing idolatry. But they don't know the difference. And where did the temptation come from? For them to then eat the meat and commit idolatry. Because of me. Their conscience. And the word conscience means with knowledge. It literally translates with knowledge. But here's the problem with my conscience. Sometimes we educate our conscience with wrong things. And we end up with wrong ideas and wrong standards and wrong values. But it's our conscience. And that's why we can see people do some really dastardly things and it doesn't bother their conscience. It's because that's how they train their conscience. The problem is, I need to grow up. I need to learn. I need to learn truth. I need to educate my conscience. Because my conscience is that which sets a judgment upon me. Have you all done something wrong and then felt guilty? That's your conscience. Now, why did you feel guilty? Because your mama told you not to do that. You had learned and were trained. And thus your conscience is guilty. But now you get in the back of the school bus and your friends tell you that's okay. So now you've trained your conscience differently to do that which mama told you not to do. That's how it works even with God. And in the world, we're constantly barged with, it's okay to do that. If you're not on Facebook, stay off. If you are, beware. If you watch the evening news, you're going to be bombarded with things that are okay, and they're not. And we need to learn to make the difference. So, having said that, Paul said, food in and of itself doesn't commend me to God. I'm neither worse off in my relationship with God if I eat that meat or if I don't eat that meat. That's not going to separate my relationship with God. But if I eat it with an idol in my brain, that's idolatry. So, I can eat it if I know better. But take care, brethren. Watch out that this liberty of yours to go ahead and eat that does not now become a temptation for the brother whose conscience has not been educated enough. You mean I need to watch out for my brother? What's that old statement? Am I my brother's keeper? And you all know the answer to that? Yes, you are. Now, he's going to do his thing, and he will stand in judgment for what he has done. But I'm going to try to help. I'm going to try to be a guiding light and a strength and resolve and to encourage. And that's what we do with one another. So I'm not going to put a stumbling block, which is an obstacle in the way of him being right with God. It is a sin that he would commit. I am not going to be the one that causes and places that temptation on that. So, if someone sees you who has knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? He thinks you're committing idolatry, so he thinks that's all right. And you are a brother in the Lord, so I can eat idolatry and still be a brother in the Lord. And his conscience being weak, he's defiled. He's eating the food as if it is to the idol, because that's what he thinks you did. And thus, you, by that way, have caused them to know, quote unquote, that it's okay. And you all realize it's not okay. And that's not what you were doing. But he doesn't know that. And so we need to protect. We need to teach him that it was not in recognition of the idol. They think, and thus it becomes that. So, verse 11. Through your knowledge, you know that an idol is nothing. He who that is weak, he doesn't know that. He is ruined. That's a hard word to translate. It basically means he's sinned and he's marred his relationship with God. He's in trouble. He will face judgment for that. And so by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you've sinned against Christ. And now I'm scared to death because now it's me that has sinned. I didn't do anything wrong. Yeah. You wounded your weak brother's conscience. Doing what was right can still be a situation for our brethren. Wow. Here's Paul's conclusion. If therefore food causes my brother to stumble, I'll never eat meat again. So you leave Corinth and you go back to Philippi, and your brethren know the difference, and they decide to have a barbecue. Go eat. And when you come back down to Corinth, they may not have learned any better, and so you behave yourself and you don't eat. It's about liberty, about where you draw the line, about protecting your brother. And so Paul said in Philippians, which was alluded to in our class, do nothing from selfish or empty conceit. Knowledge puffs up. Be careful with what you think you know. But humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves, and do not merely look out for your own interest, but also for the interest of others. And thus we take the principle and we begin trying to apply it. And I'm going to tell you, it's difficult. It is really, really, really difficult. So I moved here. And I didn't know what you all were like. I had a pretty good idea because my mama was here. And she's a pretty good judge of character, and she talked about y'all. It was good. And I found out it was good. And after I was here for a few years, y'all honored me and humbled me and scared me to death. You asked me if I would be one of the elders. And we went through the little process, and we got up and announced the very first Sunday of April that I was going to be joining Brother Steve and Brother Don and Brother Jeff as elders. Do y'all know what happened that April? COVID. And we had no idea how to deal with that. We didn't know what to do when they say you can't meet in groups larger than 10. We didn't know what to do when they said you have to wear a mask. We didn't know what to do. God didn't say anything about wearing a mask. God didn't say anything about you can't meet together if there's a influenza. And so as elders, we anguished over this. Because watching other churches, and some of you that are visiting may have been in those churches, they got arguing about all of this. And people left. And they split congregations. And they got angry. I said all of that this morning to tell you, I love you. You all did right. I don't know how you knew, but you did. As elders, we did the best we could, and so we asked that you not sit together, and we made little charts. And you all said okay. And I could tell some of you said okay, but I don't want to do that. And then we asked you when we started meeting together, rather than passing the Lord's Supper, we're going to give you these little cups. And you all said, okay. And then we asked, when you come together, would you wear a mask? And I heard some people say, that's stupid. And then they put their mask on. They didn't put their mask on because they wanted to, or thought it was brilliant, or thought that was right. They did it because we love one another, and we're doing the best we can to try to protect one another in this situation. And we do the same thing, not just with COVID, which is not sinful, but we do it with adultery and drunkenness and murder and lying and stealing and all of the things that the world throws its temptations before us. We take that into consideration and we love one another with a pure heart, fervently, protecting one another. And that's what I said. I preached all of this just to say thank you. You did good. And I'm looking forward to spending the rest of my life with you. I'm going to love you, and I know that you're going to love me. We're going to make mistakes, and we're going to deal with it, and we're going to be a congregation. Somebody always says when you talk about restoring the church, which church are you going to restore? Corinth? And they think that's a really funny, authoritative problem. And my answer is, yes, we're going to restore what Corinth should have been. We're going to take the Corinthian letter and find out what the Corinthian church should have been in its relationship with God, and that's what we're going to be. and we're going to restore. And you all have done a pretty good job. So thank you. And if you're visiting with us and you've not joined, if you're not a Christian, I'm going to tell you, first of all, you need to become a Christian because that's paramount. And then you need to join yourself with a church, a group of people that love the Lord and will love you. And I'm going to tell you, it's right here. And if you're willing and able to do that, we invite you to obey the gospel this morning. Come and we'll baptize you into Christ and you can become part of our group. If you're willing to do that, we invite you to come.